following program on Other Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the aspects of the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. What are the legal repercussions for war in different parts of the globe? And how does the law deal with such tensions before it escalates into full-blown conflict? A very good evening and thank you for joining us on yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we break down key legal concepts in the legal sphere for the layman. Now, tonight's topic is something that is very relevant. While it is not relevant directly to us and it does not impact us directly, it is very relevant at an international scale, and that is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, I know that a lot of us would have heard a lot of updates from the news because it is currently the most contentious topic. It's the most ongoing topic right now as well, and this conflict is taking a vast number of lives, but we have to really step back and look into the legal repercussions. Who can be held accountable for such conflicts, and what laws are there to try and prevent such conflicts from occurring in the first place? And to speak about public international law such as this, we have, I believe, he's not a new face on the show. We've had him a few episodes prior as well, and that is Mr. Udara Soysa. Thank you very much, sir, for taking the time to speak to us today on this very crucial topic. Now, a little bit of an introduction on Mr. Udara Soysa. He is an attorney at law. He's also a published author, as you may well know from if you watch any of our previous episodes. He's a senior law lecturer and the lecturer in charge for international law for postgraduate programs at the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies at BMICH. So, needless to say, he is one of the most qualified individuals for this topic. Now, before we get into the actual topic, let me give you a small breakdown of how this discussion is going to go. First, we'll talk about the basics of international law surrounding states such as Palestine, because I'm sure it's quite ambiguous to a lot of us. Legally, on what context is Palestine a state? Is it a state? Problems along that line. Next, we'll be talking about the current context, the conflict, and the legal responsibilities and repercussions of this conflict, and who could be held accountable. Finally, we'll be talking about potential remedies in the law for conflicts such as these.
Hi, I'm Udara Fernando and I'm a logistician. My question is on the basics of international law. What global laws govern the legality of the actions taken by Israel and Palestine respectively?
All right, well, without any further ado, let's get right into the discussion. Once again, sir, thank you for taking the time to speak to us on this very relevant topic. It's unfolding as we speak, and I'm sure a lot of us wants a bit of, a little bit of understanding on exactly what is going on in a legal sense. So, sir, I think it's very right for us to start this discussion with asking you for a little bit of a premise when it comes to international law. In this context, could you give us a little bit of context onto the international law aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict, sir?
Excellent. So, when it comes to the current conflict between Hamas, right, and generally the Palestinian uprising with Israel, it has several aspects actually. So one aspect is the obvious aspect of self-defense. Under what circumstances does a state exercise their rights to rights in terms of self-defense when it comes to facing an enemy which is a non-state actor like Hamas, right? A non-state actor. Secondly, we also need to understand about the statehood. So there are issues in terms of international law regarding statehood in terms of whether, why is Palestinian a state or not a state, right? Also, there are issues in terms of international law aspects in terms of terrorism, for example. Also, there are jurisdictional examples where when and what jurisdictional actions a state can take. So when you look at the Israel-Palestine context as an international law, almost like analysis, it is very complex, and you can list out numerous international legal aspects related to this conflict, which has been actually ongoing since 1948.
I see, sir. Now I think we should probably get into now. That was a little bit of a premonition or like a preamble to our current situation now. I'm sure this is one of the key issues that a lot of people are wondering about. Is Palestine actually a state in a legal context? What regulates it to be a state and what qualifies it in a legal aspect for it to be recognized as a state? Is it recognized at all? What are the guidelines, sir?
Excellent question. So when it comes to statehood, the convention that we have to refer is the Montevideo Convention, which has given several guidelines for a state to be recognized as a state. So I will go through each of the guidelines. So for a state to be recognized as a state, first criteria is there has to be a defined territory, right? Secondly, there should be a stable population. So there should be a stable population. One of the extremely important, I would say, aspects, right, of statehood is the concept of, I think the relevant for this matter is whether there is a functioning government. Otherwise, it will be a failed state. Example, you had Somalia, for example, where there was not really a functioning government, ultimately which ended up being a failed state. Finally, I would say you can look at the capacity to enter into international agreements with other states. So when it comes to Palestine, for example, and if you can take now, I don't know, a lot of people do not consider Hamas to be a government, right? So when it comes to Israel, for example, you have all these criteria. However, if you look at the 1948 borders of Israel to 1967, how it expanded over the years, I think Israel is one of the countries that actually exists without clear defined borders, because the borders of Israel keep on getting expanded over the years. When it comes to Palestine, for example, does it have a defined territory? It did, but it kept on getting shrinked over the years with every war. Obviously, Israel kept winning and the territory kept shrinking. And whether it has a stable population, yes. But you know, considerable amount of people in Palestine, they are in refugee camps, sometimes in Egypt, sometimes in Lebanon. A lot of people have been displaced all around Middle East. I think the key aspect is in terms of a stable government. Whether Palestine has a stable government is questionable, right? There was elections, right? And obviously Hamas was elected by the people. And secondly, many countries have historically, especially in the West, right, been very reluctant in recognizing Palestine as a state, whereas most of the countries in the Western world recognize Israel as a state, right? So I think the key point here is the recognition of other states of Palestine, and whether the UN actually recognize Palestine as a state, that is the questionable point. So this is ultimately a political issue which is almost like sugar-coated in a legal aspect, right? So if you want to take the Montevideo Convention, ultimately you can see Palestine as a state, obviously, right? But if many countries do not accept Palestine as a state, then indeed it will not be a state. So there is a huge extent of international recognition that is at play.
I see, sir. So now, apart from the political aspects of other countries recognizing Palestine as its own state, having to consider the fact that if in any instance the criteria that must be met in order to be a state, and if in case Palestine is actually a failed state, are there different repercussions for this kind of conflict? Is it turning out to be completely different in international law conflicts?
Right. Now, for example, failed state is a state which may have certain criteria. For example, Somalia, defined territory, right, stable population, but when the government is not functioning. So often you saw, even during the wartime, Sri Lanka always had a stable government which made us not a fair state. For example, tomorrow if we become into chaos and if there's no government tomorrow, even Sri Lanka could be a fair state. Fair state, definition of fair state would be not having a functional government, despite the recognition by other states. So the repercussion of, let's say, Hamas being kicked out by Israel and Palestine not having any government, obviously a fair state, I mean it's not even a state by many means, many standards per now, I think this would further promote terrorism, for example, because ultimately having a stable government is very important in keeping to a semblance of peace. Right? Obviously, we know there is no peace. We know Hamas is recognized as a terrorist organization around the world, which ultimately, I think, will hinder the Palestinians' ability to govern themselves.
I see. Now moving on, sir, to the key issue that a lot of people have brought up, and that's where most of the contention is around before the conflict ever began, and that is the aspects of the occupation of Palestinian land by Israel. Now, what are the international law concepts, or is there any legality to that? What surrounds this kind of scenario, sir?
Completely illegal, right? No state has right, very clear under UN Charter, right? Very clear under numerous UN resolutions, back to back. UN resolutions for last 30 years have consistently articulated the need for the occupation to end, right? As per international law, no country has a right to occupy another area of another state. So then we go back to the point whether Palestine is a state or not. But for sure, right? For sure, there is absolutely no international basis for the occupation. And you can see it under several judgments of International Court of Justice. For example, the advisory opinion on nuclear weapons, for example, very clearly said that they highlighted the illegality of occupation. Furthermore, there are other cases. For example, the case of continuous presence of South African troops in Namibia, for example, right? So similar contexts have been recognized as illegal. Indeed, the occupation of certain part of West Bank and other areas of Gaza, totally illegal. There is no valid international law basis. The only basis that they could Israel could argue would be self-defense. But then again, the fact that Israel has not only occupied, but rather they have also settled its population in territory of the land that is of Palestinians, it is completely illegal. In fact, settlement, right? Illegal settlement. So, for example, if a country A invades country B and settle the people of country A into country B, that is the trademark violation of every supreme article of UN Charter. This is completely illegal and cannot be accepted.
I see, sir. Well, now before we move into a break, very quickly, sir, I would like to understand now the Hamas attack on Israel. Does that by any means count as a play of self-defense? What is the legality of that entire attack? Is there any sort of grounds, a saving basis?
For Hamas, again, zero basis. Why? Again, there are two basis for use of force and international, and that is only available for states. So first question we have to ask whether Hamas actually represent and resembles the state of Palestine is of great debate. First question. Secondly, targeting, the definition of terrorism, Anuradhi, is targeting civilians to achieve, direct targeting of civilians to achieve any political goal. For example, if any group target innocent population of a country to achieve a political, religious, social, whatever the goal that may be, this is the classic definition of terrorism, which have been, again, the UN as well as international law has espoused. So completely illegal. There is no legal basis of killing innocent people in Israel. So the Hamas attack is completely illegal.
I see. Unfortunately, we had to cut the explanation short a little bit, sir, because we're going to be going in for a little bit of a break. Let's join again after the break for more discussions on the Israel-Hamas conflict and a little bit more on the legality of this entire process. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Vinoja De Silva and I am an international relations student. My question is on the current context. What legal principles govern retaliation in the ongoing conflict?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We were in conversation with Mr. Udara Soysa, attorney at law, and we were talking about the Israel-Hamas or Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, there are lots of nitty-gritties that we have to get into that we just embarked on in the previous segment, though it was cut short, sir, while we were discussing about the legality of, what repercussions are there for the attack that Hamas made on Israel's soil. Now, if you could explain to us a little bit further, sir, is there anything else to add in relation to the illegality of this attack? Now, previously we spoke about use of force as a self-defense mechanism, and so you mentioned that it was directly illegal. Are there instances where it has been somewhat legal, even if it was a grey area?
Now, for example, obviously there is this cliche, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? So if you look at historically, perhaps at the South African resistance movement of Nelson Mandela, to even back to the American Revolutionary time, you can see in certain aspects, certain level of resistance by certain groups have been accepted as okay. But however, now when we look at the UN resolutions 1373 or the later resolutions like 1540, most of these latest UN resolutions have directly aimed at countering this kind of non-state actors' attacks against citizens, right? But now, if you turn this around a little bit, what if Hamas only attacked Israel or IDF, right, or Israel Defense Forces? Then would it be justifiable as a means of resistance or self-defense? So this could have been a discussion had Hamas only attacked the combatants from other side. But if you look at Geneva Convention, if you analyze all the 4 Geneva Conventions to customary international law in terms of use of force, you cannot justify any attacks against innocent civilians. So now the fact that Hamas did engage and did kill, did slaughter innocent civilians, that now this moves this equation from any acceptable resistance to a pure horrendous actions of terrorism. But I think practically, if you look at international law, obviously the law and the story is with the victor, right? So there have been instances where certain groups, now if you look at Ho Chi Minh's resistance in Vietnam against Americans, very guerrilla movements, right? So guerrilla movements are not inherently legal. But when a guerrilla movement goes beyond attacking combatants to target children and target innocent citizens to older folks, now this is a typical terrorist situation which is not acceptable under any yardsticks in international law.
I see. Now moving on, so we should of course talk about the other side of the coin as well when it comes to Israel's attacks on Palestine, or the aspect of Israel attack on Hamas positions in the Gaza Strip, which we just recently saw as well as updates where the death toll keeps climbing. What about that, sir, in an international law conflict context? How does that play out?
Okay, so under international law, there are 3 means a state enjoys in terms of responses for some kind of a arm attack, right? So first thing obviously is we have to understand the fact that self-defense, right? When a state attacks another state, right, you can defend under Article 51 of UN Charter. Self-defense is completely acceptable. So self-defense, there's no discussion about that, whether you look at the case of Caroline to any subsequent case law of International Court of Justice, even back to Permanent Court of International Justice, self-defense has not been debatable. It is acceptable as a genuine and a most acceptable area of law. Now there is something called retortions on international law. For example, if a state attacks another state or any other issue, we can recall the ambassador, for example, as you see with happening between certain level of retortions happening between Canada and India, for example, with certain assassinations of certain members of some group in Canada. So retortions are also legal, also self-defense. What is illegal is reprisal attacks. That means revenge attacks are illegal. Whether under domestic law or whether under international law, revenge attacks cannot be justified under any circumstances. So what would be a revenge attack? Country A attacks country B. There is no necessity for self-defense for country B. Just to get back at country A, country B attacks country A in terms of taking revenge. So if you look at Israel attack as a revenge attack or reprisal attack, as seen in there's a case called Naulina case, right? Completely illegal. You cannot attack in revenge. But if Israel legitimately believes that there are Hamas fighters in either West Bank or Gaza Strip, in that situation, obviously, Israel has rights under Article 51 to ward off those attacks. However, one must understand self-defense is not a blanket tool that a state enjoys over its matters. So self-defense, there is a level of proportionality. Right? There's an issue of necessity and reasonableness. So is it necessary? Is it reasonable? And it's indeed whether it's proportional. So those are also factors that the Israel has to consider. So now, for example, last 24 hours, Israel, right, has instructed the UN and other agencies to get over 1 million, relocate 1 million people from the Gaza Strip, which is, this would totally be going against international law, because you cannot within 24 hours force like over 1 million people to relocate without expecting a dire humanitarian consequence. So all of that aspects has to be considered. You cannot, just because you got attacked by a terrorist group, you just cannot bomb that location into Stone Age. That is not what international law is about. That would be completely illegal, and other states should also prevent Israel from doing such violation and almost a genocide of people.
I see. Now, on the people context, there's a lot of concern about especially the evacuations that are to take place extremely swiftly as well, and the escalating tensions that don't seem to be simmering down at any moment. Could you please explain to us, in such a conflict, in such a context, is there under law protections afforded to civilians in times of conflict like this?
Clearly. I think the maximum amount of protection in a civil context, right? I think a maximum amount of protection given in the civil context is for civilians, right? So if you look at Geneva Convention, very clearly Geneva Convention says, right, citizens has to be protected under any circumstances. You cannot target. Even if a combatant now is wounded, you cannot target the combatant. So civilians under customary international law, again through, there's very clear UN focus on protecting civilians. So civilians cannot be targeted under any circumstances. However, indeed, the problem, Anuradhi, is when, now, what if a terror group members are hiding, right, among civilians? Then the international law angle in that perspective, at that scenario, is not very clear. In one hand, the international law allows a state, despite in asymmetric warfare, of guerrilla warfare, to self-defend itself. But at the same time, does that self-defense include, or can it be extended to a point of attacking citizens when terror members or when guerrilla members are within the citizenry? So that is an area of international law that is not clear, and I don't think it will ever be clear, because how can you not allow or allow at the same time, because you cannot protect terrorists by covering them with citizens. At the same time, you cannot make citizens vulnerable because there are terrorists around them. So this is I don't think in any foreseeable international legal discourse whether we will be able to find solution for this kind of a catch-22 question.
I see. But on that context, now going off of that question, a lot of people are mentioning that it is a bit of, on a humanitarian scale, it's a little bit of more of a grey area, less of a black and white. So could you explain to us now, on a humanitarian front, Are Israel's actions absolutely lethal and undeniably wrong? Is it a humanitarian war that Israel is participating in?
So basically, when it comes to humanitarian law, right? So what is humanitarian law? Humanitarian law is the law that governs the conduct of state during time of war, right? So this is different from human rights law. Human rights law can be basically you being a journalist, not being tortured or protected. That would be human rights law. But when like during conflict, during armed conflict, right? How combatants are treated, what weapons can be used, what actions can be used, that is the basis of humanitarian law. Humanitarian law is a law that governs the conduct of a state in terms of war. So now, when it comes to an attack, right? There are certain criteria, certain guidelines that Israel will have to take into its account. So one of the key points Israel has to take note is to minimize any direct or indirect civilian casualty. Because just because there are some potential terrorists among the midst of citizens, you cannot just bomb everybody. So, but what you can see with the last several days of air bombardments of Gaza Strip, right? I think there were like thousands air raids, so that is unprecedented. So that this type of indiscriminate attacks are totally illegal. However, I would say as per international law, right, you could target combatants, for example, Hamas groups, etc., if you have credible information. But I don't think right now whether the Israel is concerned so much about that, but rather going on a massive bombing spree to almost to bomb Hamas out of its existence. But any indiscriminate attack that is, as you said, lethal can create a humanitarian conflict and is again illegal under international law. You cannot attack everybody for the sins of few, right? Then some may argue, oh yes, Palestinians indeed voted in Hamas, so Palestinians are indirectly responsible for what Hamas does. But this is not a very good argument. You cannot, just because you vote for somebody, you cannot take responsibility for and to being bombed out of your existence due to your choice in terms of an election, or that is not justifiable. There's no justifiable argument you can make to support indiscriminate bombing of innocent citizens of Gaza, who has gone through over not just a decade, decades and decades and decades. For they have been refugees from earliest times, like 1960s, right, 1970s, 1980s. So, as this bombing without any limits, whether it is not clearly moral, obviously, and it's not legal, obviously, as well, but this kind of attacks obviously will lead to further violence and further terrorism and further breaches of international law by both parties.
I see. Now, sir, the fact that we spoke about the definition of a state earlier, unfortunately, I'm going to have to loop it in a little bit for this segment as well to ask a question of curiosity that I'm sure some of our viewers might be thinking about at the moment, because we've seen Afghanistan and the Taliban happen. Now, it is just a few years, it's been a very short span of time, but the course of events has been quite, it's been very, very much, a lot has been happening. And we see Palestine, we see Hamas, while Hamas was voted in. When it comes to definitions of state, is there any sort of likeness between Afghanistan's Taliban and Palestine's Hamas? I
think that's a good parallel. That 10 years ago, nobody would have recognized a Taliban Afghanistan, right? So now Taliban actually took control of Afghanistan not recently, but back in 90s, as you know, right, in mid-90s. And ultimately this led to Al-Qaeda being proliferated in Afghanistan, and ultimately for 9/11, then Americans came and kicked Taliban out. And obviously nobody thought Americans and the Western forces would be okay with a Taliban government. But now you see a lot of countries have now come to terms with the fact that a Taliban government is an inevitability in Afghanistan. So this goes back to that final part of Montevideo Convention about acceptance by other states. So this is where politics and law becomes inherently intertwined. So if majority of the countries are able to like remove its terrorist designation of Hamas and consider Hamas as a legitimate entity, perhaps then then they may have been a recognizable government under international law. However, with these recent attacks where Hamas have now indiscriminately violated international law, killed citizens, civilians, Israeli citizens, children, right, partygoers, right, innocent people. So in this sense, obviously, it's very unlikely that Hamas will get any recognition. But you must remember the Taliban behavior now, right? So if you look at Taliban behavior 15 years back and now, you can see clear difference, right? Talibans are now, to some extent, maybe for a short, some extent, they're trying to show that force, like not now. I think last week they have returned an American who was stuck in Afghanistan. So ultimately, it is what others recognize you as which will determine your international legal destiny to be recognized. So if under international law, if you are able to get other states to recognize you as a legitimate entity, you will gain that legitimacy. If you don't, then you are having a questionable status. So if you look at a lot of countries which were actually perhaps the breakaway countries, if you look at Kosovo, for example, so if enough countries recognize Kosovo, now the Kosovo statehood will be recognized. Now, if you look at the International Court of Justice opinion on Kosovo, what they said was Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence was not illegal. So this is an area of law that is developing, right? So any country can, or any entity can declare itself to be a sovereign state, but whether they might have, perhaps they might also have population, government, and a boundary. But whether the other states recognize its existence as a state, which consequently will bestow upon its a level of sovereignty, which will give a point of sovereignty, that is the question. So a level of international relations must be connected to international law. Without that, you are not able to understand.
You can't have one without the other. Yes,
indeed.
It's quite intertwined. Well, unfortunately, we've come up to time in this segment as well. Join us again on the next segment as we discuss more into detail on the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is Law, Land and Liberty. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Nikini and I'm a law student. My question is on conflicts and the future. Are there fresh legal developments coming into play which is specific to the current unfolding wars?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We were in discussion with Ms. Udara Soysa, attorney at law, and we were talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the nitty-gritties related to this conflict that's ongoing and unfolding in real time. Now, sir, before we went into the break, we talked about the technicalities of, certain attacks that happened over the past few days and, of course, the humanitarian aspects of this crisis. Now, sir, I think a lot of us would like to know, when such attacks happen, what provisions can a state like Israel be granted in order to take action when there's a terrorist attack, sir?
Excellent point. So now, when a country is attacked by a terror group, obviously it has a right to self-defense, right? Now, however, provided that this must be done within the scope of UN Security Council, and a country has a right to self-defend itself, self-defense, up until there are available measures and recourses at the Security Council. So if a state is attacked, ideal position to take would be to get assistance, from other states, etc., and form a broader coalition to fight this threat. Often, in this context, UN Security Council would have been the ideal forum, right? However, the problem with the UN Security Council is, obviously, as we discussed in our earlier segment, program, is the issue of veto powers, right? So if UN advisors or UN assistance was sought by Israel in this context, obviously any unilateral support to Israel from UN Security Council would be negated by perhaps a Chinese or Russian veto. So in that sense, when a country is attacked by another terrorist group, etc., right, there is the right to self-defend, obviously, but ultimately, if it's done by non-state actors, there is actually a limited recourse the state can independently and individually take against that threat. So in a situation where, let's say, a state attacks another state, then obviously then the situation is easier because then the other state can be attacked in self-defense. But the biggest problem we have is these terrorists are living with the general population. But now the issue is, since Hamas, if Hamas can be taken as a legitimate government of Palestine, so any attack done by Hamas against Israel can also be defined as an attack by Palestine against the state of Israel. So in that sense, clearly, to defend itself, Israel can use force. But now, again, we spoke about the innocent civilians losing their lives. But you must also understand practically in every conflict from the time of humankind, whether it's World War I to World War II to Vietnam War to Korean War, whether it's first Gulf War, second Gulf War, right? Ultimately, citizens are always a collateral damage, right? So ultimately, I think whether you can prevent zero civilian casualty, that would be nonsensical. I don't think any conflict can preclude the deaths of civilians and citizens. But I think what is important is when a state like Israel or any other state exercises its right to defend itself, what is of paramount importance is the need to ensure the state act within a proportional guideline, right? Just because you had 1,000 people dead, that doesn't mean you have to kill 100,000 of other side in terms of revenge. That would be a revenge that would also be disproportionate. So it must be precision or as much as possible targeting of terrorist members and the leaders to our best knowledge, and without attacking hospitals, without attacking mosques, without attacking schools. So that must be done in a balanced way to target and to neutralize the terrorist threat, right? So the targeting must not be to subjugate the entire population, to kill children, and to generally to commit genocide. That would not be the way to defend yourself. So if you have a terrorist threat from whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, whatever the group that may be, what is paramount, what is important, what is vital is we target and neutralize the threat, and that should not also be used as a way of gaining further Palestinian land, for example. Just because this happened now, that doesn't mean that Israel can take over another 1/3 or half of Gaza Strip and establish a settlement. That would be further illegal.
I see. Now, moving on, sir, before we go into the concluding remarks of this entire discussion, I'd like to ask you, sir, we spoke a little bit earlier about this as well, regarding terrorists blending in with normal civilians. What is the position of international law when it comes to such a situation? Has there been any changes in modern law?
Unfortunately not, right? So we have the latest UN, not latest, but the present modern 2 UN resolutions, right? When it comes to terrorism, right, 1373, right, and 1540. So what we see is there is a general consensus among jurists of international law that it is completely acceptable to attack terrorist groups and neutralize the threats. But when they are among civilians, when they are among citizens, the law is unclear, because ultimately the practical point here is you are not able to, you're practically unable to discern between who's a citizen and who's a terrorist. So ultimately, I think in generally, I think it will be very difficult to create an international law regime to address this kind of situation, because you can't, if it would be wrong to allow it would be wrong to allow a state to attack a area in a ground that has citizens and terrorists just to attack terrorists. At the same time, it would be wrong to ban a state from targeting terrorists just because they are living and mixing up with citizens. So I don't think that part of international law would be developed in any time soon. However, I think the law need to develop further to stop terrorist funding. Right now, there are some countries, obviously, perhaps alleged to be helping these groups. So perhaps that would be the new developments, like how to counter the terrorist financing. And there are actual development of a lot of domestic legal systems in a lot of countries. But I think international law should further consolidate its general mechanisms to stop terrorist funding or terrorist movements. How are these people getting all these weapons? How are these people getting all these gliders, etc., when it's surrounded? So all of that has to be, which are the states that are supporting? So what are the consequences for those states for terrorist actions? But at the same time, how are you going to actually get all these other countries to agree? Because international law is a horizontal system. You are only able to have international law if all the states agree for that mechanism. Otherwise, so I think it will be a very difficult task, I think, moving forward.
I see. Well, unfortunately, we have come to time in this segment as well, and that concludes our discussion. I'm sure a lot of our viewers would have had a better understanding now of the entire conflict and the legal aspects of this conflict as well. There is more than meets the eye. It's a huge moral grey area, but it's important that each of us takes our duty in learning and understanding what the conflict is on a legal as well as a humanitarian level. And thanks again very much, sir, for taking the time to explain to our viewers, because this is a very important and relevant, timely topic that I'm sure that a lot of people would be a little bit afraid to approach because of how daunting the nature of the context is. So thanks again, sir, for taking the time. All right, well, the conflict in the Middle East may not be one that seems to affect any of us on a personal level. Still, it is important to step back and assess such a situation. As citizens of a nation that is no stranger to conflict, we must uphold our duty to be law-abiding and just, even in trying times. We leave you tonight with the words of Arthur Henderson, a former Nobel Peace Prize laureate. To solve the problem of organizing world peace, we must establish world law and order. That is all we have for you on Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed any of tonight's programs, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/otherthanenglish. Thank you for watching. Have a great night.